Chapter 1: The Impossible Order. September 1940. The world was burning. France had fallen, Britain was barely holding the line, and in a small, smoke-stained office on Long Island, an immigrant engineer named Alexander Kartveli unfolded a telegram that would change aviation forever. The message was short, almost absurd. The U.S. Army Air Corps wanted a new fighter plane, one that could climb higher, fly faster, hit harder, and survive longer than anything ever built. And they wanted it airborne in 8 months. Most planes took 3 years just to leave the drawing board. It wasn't a request, it was a demand that bordered on lunacy. Kartveli wasn't the kind of man who said, "Impossible." Born in Tbilisi, trained in France, and tempered by the hard edges of the Great Depression, he had already designed 2 successful fighters, the P-35 and P-43 Lancer. But this was a leap into the unknown. The Army's specifications read like fantasy: a fighter that could escort bombers to 40,000 feet, carry 8 50 caliber machine guns, and still be fast enough to outrun the Luftwaffe. And above all, it had to survive combat, not just once, but over and over again. The numbers didn't add up. Inline engines like those in British Spitfires couldn't breathe at such heights. Radial engines were powerful but bulky, their drag killing speed. The math said no. The war said yes. So Kartveli lit another cigarette, pushed aside the papers on his desk, and began sketching. By midnight, the wastebasket overflowed with crumpled blueprints, and the walls were covered with rough outlines of wings, fuselages, and air ducts. He wasn't just designing a plane, he was rewriting the laws of what a fighter could be. By dawn, a few things were clear. The fighter would be big, heavier than any single-engine aircraft before it. It would carry the most powerful radial engine America could build. It would climb through air so thin that other planes suffocated. And it would need systems within systems, backups for every failure, armor for every weak spot. This wasn't going to be a sleek duelist like the Spitfire or a nimble dancer like the Zero. It was going to be a brute, an iron brawler built for the long haul. Kartveli's team of 37 engineers began arriving at sunrise, most of them too young to understand how insane their mission really was. They ran calculations on slide rules, punched through nights fueled by bad coffee and worse nerves. Every mistake meant another day lost. Every sketch brought them 1 inch closer to the unthinkable. A machine that could take on the Luftwaffe at its own altitude and win. Kartveli knew they weren't just building a fighter. They were building a shield, a machine that would decide whether American pilots lived or died. Outside, the world was preparing for war. Inside that crowded office, a Georgian immigrant was sketching the blueprint of survival. And as his pencil scratched over another sheet of paper, he whispered the quiet truth that would define everything to come. Speed wins battles, but survival wins wars. That night, under the hum of desk lamps and the smell of burnt tobacco, the legend of the P-47 Thunderbolt began to take shape. An impossible idea born from fear, genius, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to physics. Chapter 2: The Monster Takes Shape. By October 1940, the walls of Alexander Kartveli's office at Republic Aviation looked less like an engineer's workspace and more like the inside of a man's mind unraveling under genius. Every inch was covered with sketches, wings, ducts, pressure lines, each one crossed out and redrawn. The Army's impossible deadline loomed over the team like a storm cloud, 8 months to create something that had never existed before. They weren't building a plane. They were building a miracle out of math, metal, and exhaustion. Kartveli's breakthrough came when he made a decision no one else dared to make. He would design the P-47 around the biggest, most powerful aircraft engine on Earth, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, and so heavy it could crush the nose of most fighters. The engine was meant for the Navy's Corsair, and Washington didn't want to share it. But Kartveli fought for it, because he knew power meant altitude, and altitude meant survival. To make it work, he had to throw away every elegant principle of fighter design. The fuselage ballooned to fit the monstrous radial engine. The wings thickened to hold 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns and over 3,000 rounds of ammunition. The aircraft began to look less like a Spitfire and more like a flying milk bottle. Even his own engineers joked that it looked pregnant. But underneath that awkward shape, brilliance was taking form. The R-2800 demanded a revolutionary airflow system, a turbo-supercharger capable of feeding oxygen to the engine at 40,000 feet, where the air was thin as a whisper. The solution came from an idea that most thought insane. Mount the turbo-supercharger not near the engine, but far in the rear fuselage, connected by a duct running beneath the cockpit. That single decision transformed the P-47 into something no one had ever seen before, an aircraft whose belly housed the lungs of its own heart. It was ugly, yes, but it worked. Every week brought new drawings, new headaches, and new defiance. The team ran tests on small-scale mock-ups, studying airflow like detectives chasing invisible crimes. They burned through metal, cigarettes, and midnight hours in equal measure. Engineers learned to crawl inside the ducts they had built to test pressure flow. They welded seams by hand, hammering the idea of survival into every inch of aluminum. Republic's president, Alfred Marcel, came down to the floor one night, saw the team half asleep over slide rules and grease-stained tables, and said quietly, "We're building a tank with wings." Kartveli didn't disagree. By December 1940, the first full-scale wooden mock-up stood in the hangar, hulking, uneven, and magnificent. Army inspectors circled it skeptically, measuring panels, tapping the skin with their knuckles. One of them, a veteran pilot with scars from the last war, finally muttered, "It's ugly as hell, Kartveli, but build it anyway." Kartveli didn't smile. He just nodded, knowing that beauty wasn't the point. The P-47 wasn't born to dazzle. It was born to endure. Every extra pound of steel was a promise. When something breaks at 25,000 feet, the man inside won't die because of it. That philosophy would soon guide every decision that followed. And when the prototype finally touched sky, as Chapter 3 would show, that philosophy would be tested not in equations, but in vibration, failure, and the roar of an engine that refused to quit. Chapter 3. Fire and Air, March 1941. A prototype engine roared inside a test bay in Farmingdale, New York, loud enough to rattle window panes 3 blocks away. The people living nearby called the police. The police stopped calling back. What Republic Aviation was doing inside that hangar sounded like a furnace tearing itself apart. But to Alexander Kartveli, that noise was the sound of something living, the heart of the P-47 Thunderbolt, learning to breathe fire at 40,000 feet. The test rig wasn't even an airplane. It was half a fuselage bolted to a slab of concrete, its aluminum skin glowing red where exhaust gases ran through the turbo-supercharger ducts. For hours at a time, engineers stood behind blast shields while the R-2800 engine screamed, spitting smoke and flame. The air inside the test cell shimmered with heat. A clipboard could ignite if you set it down too close. Chapter 3. Fire and Air, March 1941. At the core of the experiment was a question no one else had solved. How do you make an engine breathe in the stratosphere? At 40,000 feet, air pressure drops to less than 1/3 of what it is on the ground. Most engines suffocate. Kartveli's solution was as brutal as it was brilliant. A giant turbo-supercharger buried deep in the belly of the aircraft. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't light, but it worked. The massive ventral duct underneath the nose would scoop in cold air, rush it through smooth aluminum pipes under the cockpit, spin it through a red-hot turbine, and force it back into the engine with the pressure of a small hurricane. Every part of that system had to survive heat that could melt aluminum and airflow fast enough to rip metal seams apart. Republic's metalworkers built the ducts wide enough to crawl through, welding each joint by hand, testing them for leaks with soapy water and compressed air. The pressure inside those ducts, one engineer calculated, could fill an entire house with air every minute. For Kartveli, this wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about survival. The turbo-supercharger would give the Thunderbolt what no other fighter had, the ability to fight in the thin, cold air above 30,000 feet, where German bombers once flew without fear. But altitude wasn't the only problem. Fire was. The R-2800 burned through 120 gallons of high-octane fuel per hour, and every pipe carrying it ran just inches from the glowing ducts of the turbo system. One loose clamp, one cracked weld, and the aircraft would become its own cremation chamber. So Kartveli changed the rules again. Every fuel tank would be self-sealing, lined with vulcanized rubber that swelled shut when punctured. The entire system would be pressurized with carbon dioxide to prevent explosions. Redundant lines would crisscross through armored bulkheads so that one lucky bullet wouldn't drain the plane dry. His team started to see the pattern. This wasn't a fighter built to dance. It was a flying fortress condensed into a single seat. It wasn't the fastest or the sleekest or the most graceful, but it would outlast anything that tried to kill it. By spring, the test engines could hold full power at altitude for hours. When the last vibration died down and the air cooled, the engineers stepped into the silence and realized what they had built. This wasn't just a machine, it was an organism, something that could take a beating, adapt, and keep living. When the neighbors complained again about the noise, Kartveli just smiled. That, he said, is the sound of survival. In that furnace of noise and air, America had quietly built a fighter that would carry its pilots higher than fear, into the cold, thin sky where breath itself froze. It was ugly, loud, and heavy, but it breathed fire, and that was enough. Chapter 4. The Quest for Survival. By April 1941, the Thunderbolt's heartbeat, that monstrous R-2800 engine, was alive and breathing fire. But Alexander Kartveli knew one thing about machines. Engines don't win wars, pilots do. And a dead pilot, he kept saying, can't fight another day. While other designers chased glamour and speed, he began asking a question almost nobody else in the world of fighter planes dared to ask. What happens when something breaks at 25,000 feet? That single question would turn the P-47 from a fast airplane into a flying fortress, a machine engineered not to impress, but to survive. Most fighters of the early 1940s were built like race cars, light, fast, and fragile. A single incendiary bullet in the wrong spot could turn them into falling torches. The British Spitfire, the German Bf-109, even America's own P-40 Warhawk carried one major weakness. All their critical systems ran through one fragile channel. One hit, and the pilot was gone. Kartveli tore that philosophy apart. The P-47 would be different. It would assume everything would go wrong, and still keep flying. The first battle was against the fuel system. In most fighters, the main tank sat right in front of the cockpit. If that tank caught fire, the pilot was trapped in a cockpit-sized furnace. So Kartveli redesigned it from scratch. The Thunderbolt carried 7 separate fuel tanks, 2 in the wings, 1 in the fuselage, and provisions for 4 external drop tanks. If 3 were destroyed, the plane could still limp home. Every tank was lined with self-sealing rubber that swelled when hit by bullets, plugging holes automatically. A carbon dioxide system kept the tanks under slight pressure, preventing fuel vapors from igniting. Republic engineers even added a cross-feed network, a web of valves and lines that let the pilot reroute fuel between tanks in mid-flight, keeping the engine running no matter what was leaking. When the fuel system drawings were finished, they looked like a subway map of New York, dense, complicated, but deliberate. A design born from paranoia, perfected by experience. Then came the hydraulics. Landing gear, flaps, cowl flaps, all powered by hydraulic lines that, in any other fighter, would mean disaster if one line burst. Kartveli ordered dual systems, each completely independent. If both were shot out, a manual hand pump in the cockpit could lower the landing gear by muscle alone. Test pilots later joked that it took arms like a dock worker to use, but it worked. Flight controls followed the same logic. Elevator, rudder, and aileron cables were separated into different channels, each divided by armored bulkheads. A 20mm cannon shell could tear through one cable and still leave 2 others untouched. Even if all 3 failed, the control surfaces were designed to float to neutral rather than locking hard over, a small miracle that could save a spinning, dying plane. And finally, the electrics. Most aircraft had a single generator. When it failed, everything went dark: radios, instruments, gun sight. The Thunderbolt had 4 independent electrical buses, each with its own power source. Lose one, lose 2, the others stayed alive. Pilots would later say it felt like flying a tank that could think. Every new feature added weight. Every redundancy slowed the plane a little more. Critics said Kartveli was over-engineering a mistake, that the Thunderbolt would be too heavy to fight, too complex to maintain. But Kartveli didn't flinch. Simple designs make cheap coffins, he told his team. That line spread across the factory floor like gospel. It wasn't about arrogance, it was belief. A belief that America could build a machine that valued human life more than numbers on a chart. While the Luftwaffe designed perfect killing tools, Kartveli was building a survivor. By the time the prototype was ready for its first flight, the P-47 wasn't just a fighter, it was a philosophy. Every wire, pipe, and bolt carried one quiet message to the men who would soon fly it over Europe. We built this so you can come home. The Thunderbolt might never turn as tight as a Spitfire or climb as elegantly as a Messerschmitt. But when the sky filled with tracers and flak, when engines bled oil and wings caught fire, it would be the one machine still flying, stubborn, scarred, but alive. It was no longer just an airplane. It was America's promise in metal form. That courage alone wasn't enough, but courage with engineering could be indestructible. Chapter 5: The Test Pilot's Nightmare, May 6, 1941. Farmingdale Airfield shimmered in the spring sun as test pilot Lowry Brabham climbed into the cockpit of the XP-47B prototype. The mechanics stood back, their shirts soaked in sweat and nervousness. No one said a word. This was the moment months of sleepless nights and burned fingertips had led to. The first flight of a machine so heavy that many engineers quietly doubted it could leave the ground at all. The P-47 weighed over 12,000 pounds empty, nearly twice a Spitfire. It was the largest single-engine fighter ever built, a brute force experiment that looked more like a flying milk bottle than a warplane. But when Brabham pushed the throttle forward, the ground itself seemed to tremble. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 roared, shaking windows half a mile away. The aircraft lumbered down the runway like a reluctant beast, slow, stubborn, and impossibly heavy. At 4,000 feet down the strip, the wheels finally lifted. It wasn't graceful. It clawed its way into the air through sheer willpower. On the ground, Kartveli exhaled for the first time in 30 seconds. The monster could fly. Up in the cockpit, Brabham felt the control stick heavy but stable, like steering a train through the sky. He ran through his checks: climb rate, control response, stall speed. Everything behaved predictably. He climbed higher, 10,000 feet, then 15,000. The engine purred, the gauges steadied. Then, at 25,000 feet, a faint vibration tickled through the stick. Harmless, he thought. Turbulence, maybe. But the vibration grew. At 28,000 feet, it became violent, a hammering through metal and bone. The entire aircraft shook so hard the instruments blurred. His vision tunneled. The canopy rattled like it would explode. Brabham's instincts took over. He throttled back, dropped the nose, and dove for thicker air. The shaking eased at 25,000 feet, then vanished completely at 20,000. He circled the field for 10 minutes, mapping the danger zone, then landed hard and silent. The crew ran up. He unstrapped, face pale. "We've got a serious flutter problem," he said simply. The next 48 hours turned the Republic hangar into a war room. Engineers swarmed the plane, checking every bolt, cable, and panel. They rebalanced the propeller, realigned the turbo ducts, adjusted control cables, everything measured within tolerance. The mystery deepened. A second test flight confirmed the same violent oscillation above 28,000 feet, the same altitude the plane was designed to dominate. Kartveli's team hauled the prototype to New York University's wind tunnel. There, they discovered the culprit: air turbulence forming behind the canopy at high altitude. The thinner air caused the tail's fabric-covered elevators to flex, creating oscillations that amplified until the entire fuselage resonated like a tuning fork. The solution was drastic and heavy. Replace all fabric control surfaces with all metal ones, reinforce the tail, and reshape the canopy to smooth airflow. It added 180 pounds and delayed the project by 2 months. But there was no other way. During those 2 months, Kartveli barely slept. Army officials were already furious about delays. The contract was on the edge of cancellation. But when the modified prototype finally flew again, Brabham climbed past 30,000 feet without a tremor. The monster was cured, solid, stable, unbreakable. That first series of test flights exposed every weakness and every strength of the Thunderbolt. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't easy, but it was honest. Every problem they fixed made the plane tougher, more indestructible. At Wright Field in Ohio, the Army's test facility, the Thunderbolt faced its real crucible. Engineers there treated prototypes like soldiers in boot camp, break them to see if they're worth saving. Hydraulic arms bent the wings to 9 Gs, then 10, then 11. They fired 50 caliber rounds into the wings to test if ammunition boxes would detonate. They didn't. They froze the cockpit to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then baked it to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. They slammed the landing gear thousands of times. They fired machine guns until gun cameras shook apart. Every flaw uncovered became another chapter in the Thunderbolt's evolution. By the end of 1941, the P-47 had been tortured, shaken, and nearly destroyed, but it refused to die. Every dent, every failure became a layer of armor. The plane that had terrified test pilots now began earning their respect. "It's a brute," one said, "but it's our brute." Kartveli knew then what kind of machine he had built. It wasn't made to please generals or look good in parades. It was made to take a punch, to protect the men inside when the world outside turned to chaos. The XP-47B had shaken itself apart at 30,000 feet and lived to tell the story. And from that day on, it would carry a new name whispered around the hangars of Republic Aviation, the Jug. Big, ugly, unstoppable. The kind of plane that, once airborne, made even the sky step aside. Chapter 6, The Torture Chamber at Wright Field. By August 1941, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a blueprint or a rumor. It was a 12,000-pound slab of American stubbornness waiting to prove it could survive the most brutal test program the U.S. Army Air Corps had ever devised. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, engineers called it the torture chamber, a place where promising aircraft went to be broken, bent, and shot until they either earned a serial number or a gravestone. Alexander Kartveli watched from the observation deck as his creation was rolled inside. This was the moment of truth. The prototype had survived test flights and violent flutter, but now it would face something worse than the enemy: physics, bureaucracy, and time. The Army's evaluation team didn't test airplanes gently. They strapped them into hydraulic rigs that twisted wings and fuselages until rivets screamed. The Thunderbolt's first trial was structural fatigue, a slow mechanical torture. Pistons pushed and pulled on the wings, simulating combat loads far beyond human endurance. At 9 Gs, the steel frames groaned. At 10, inspectors exchanged looks. At 11, the test engineers expected an explosion of metal. Instead, the wings bent, quivered, and held. The Thunderbolt had passed the first ordeal. Next came the landing gear trials. For weeks, the hydraulic system slammed the gear up and down thousands of times, simulating carrier-style landings, even though this wasn't a Navy plane. Republic engineers had built dual hydraulic circuits and a manual backup pump. The Army wanted to know if that claim was more than marketing. They drained one system of fluid and pulled the hand pump. 200 strokes later, the landing gear locked into place. The test officer nodded. "You'll need arms like a prize fighter," he said, "but she'll come down alive." Then came the gunfire. Testers mounted armor plates and fired 50 caliber rounds point blank into the wings to verify ammunition boxes wouldn't cook off. The guns roared, punching through aluminum. The bullets tore fabric and fuel lines. Nothing exploded. The ammo belt stayed cool. The test officer wrote only 2 words in his report: satisfactory performance. The problems that did appear weren't glamorous. When all 8 machine guns fired at once, their recoil and vibration blurred the gun sight camera until pilots couldn't tell what they were shooting at. Republic's engineers reinforced the wing ribs and added vibration dampers, but the shake persisted. The fix came not from Kartveli, but from a young technician who suggested staggering the gunfire in microseconds, so they never all fired simultaneously. The solution reduced vibration by 40% and became a standard across later fighters. There were smaller nightmares, too. At 35,000 feet, pilots testing the Thunderbolt began reporting headaches, dizziness, and the creeping numbness of hypoxia. The cockpit heating system was pulling air mixed with carbon monoxide from the engine bay. The very warmth meant to keep pilots alive was slowly poisoning them. Republic scrambled for a fix, installing carbon monoxide detectors and redesigning the airflow ducts with heat exchangers. It worked, mostly. But every improvement added weight, and weight was the Thunderbolt's curse. By winter, the list of modifications had grown to 73 major changes, and more than 200 minor ones. Each solved a problem, and each made the plane uglier and heavier. Critics in Washington grumbled that Republic was building a flying anvil, but when the test numbers came in, the same critics went silent. The Thunderbolt could pull 11 Gs without failure, absorb cannon hits without catching fire, and still fly straight with half its control surfaces shredded. For pilots, these results meant something deeper than performance statistics. It meant trust. When a man climbed into a Thunderbolt, he knew the people who built it had imagined every possible way he might die and had designed a system to prevent it. There was a quiet kind of faith in that. In one test, a 20mm shell tore through the fuselage and severed both main control cables. The aircraft went into a shallow dive, but instead of spinning out, the elevator trimmed itself to neutral, exactly as Kartveli had designed. The test pilot landed safely, stepped out, and said only, "She wanted to live." Right field broke many aircraft. The Thunderbolt refused to break. Every failure turned into a refinement. Every weakness became another lesson in survival. It wasn't the prettiest machine on the ramp, but it was the toughest. A fighter built like a philosophy. No single point of failure, ever. By the time the Army finished its trials, the Thunderbolt had transformed from a prototype into a war machine. It had sweated through fire, vibration, poison, and gunfire, and it kept flying. When engineers packed up their tools and rolled it out of the hangar, the scars on its fuselage looked almost deliberate. Badges of proof. For Kartveli, standing beside the battered prototype, there was no applause, no ceremony, just the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew what the tests really proved, that his ugly, overbuilt monster could outlast anything the sky threw at it. The P-47 had passed the torture chamber. Now, it was ready for war. Chapter 7. Baptism over Germany, March 6, 1943. The skies above Germany were bone gray and trembling with sound. Below, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses droned east toward the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, a target so vital that the Allies called it the heart of Hitler's war machine. High above the bombers, their guardians waited, the new P-47 Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group. For months, this beast of an airplane had been tortured, tested, and mocked. Too heavy, too clumsy, too late. But today would decide everything. If it could survive combat the way it had survived the test chambers, the Thunderbolt would earn its name in blood and fire. At 23,000 feet, the Luftwaffe came screaming out of the clouds. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s dove through the bomber formations, cannons blazing. The sky turned into a maze of smoke trails and burning metal. The Thunderbolts rolled in to meet them, engines howling, 50 caliber guns blazing. Each aircraft carried 8 heavy machine guns, 400 rounds per second, enough firepower to chew through armor. But this battle wasn't about firepower. It was about survival. Captain Walter Cook took a 20mm cannon shell through his right wing. The explosion left a hole big enough to crawl through. The wing flexed, groaned, but held. He stayed in formation. Moments later, Lieutenant Robert Johnson found himself under the guns of an FW-190 Ace who made 3 passes, each one peppering the Thunderbolt with fire. 2 cylinders shattered. Oil splattered across the canopy. The cockpit filled with smoke so thick he couldn't read the instruments. The German pilot, certain his target was dead, peeled away. But Johnson's engine, the R-2800 that Kartveli had once called the heart of survival, kept running on 14 cylinders and pure mechanical spite. He crossed 400 miles of enemy territory and landed in England, trembling but alive. Back at Horsham St. Faith Airfield, ground crews swarmed the returning fighters. They counted bullet holes like doctors reading X-rays. Cook's P-47 had 21 cannon hits and over 200 machine gun punctures. Another plane came in with a tail so shredded it looked like lace. A third had its fuel tank torn open, but it hadn't exploded. The self-sealing rubber had swollen shut, just as Kartveli had designed. Not one of those aircraft burned. Not one pilot was lost. That night, over lukewarm coffee and cigarette smoke, the pilots said little. They didn't need to. The evidence was sitting outside, cooling under the British rain. War machines that had taken everything the enemy could throw and still brought their men home. The statistics told the same story. Through 1943, Thunderbolt loss rates hovered below 2% per sortie, half that of the P-38 Lightning and one-third that of the P-39 Airacobra. Analysts at 8th Air Force Headquarters ran the numbers twice, then 3 times. The result was undeniable. A pilot flying a P-47 had the best survival odds in the European theater. The press back home started calling it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and the name stuck. Pilots laughed at it, but the nickname fit. It wasn't fast or pretty, but it hit like a freight train and absorbed punishment like a fortress. Even Luftwaffe pilots began to fear its silhouette. "You can shoot at a Thunderbolt all day," one German ace complained, "and it will still be there to kill you tomorrow." In the field reports, one line appeared again and again: "Pilot returned safely." That was Kartveli's real victory. Every redundant system, every ounce of armor, every sleepless night sketching in cigarette smoke had led to this moment. American pilots walking away from planes that should have fallen from the sky. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to look good in photographs or win races. It was built for the hardest truth of war, to keep human beings alive inside chaos. And on that cold March day over Germany, it did exactly that. When the last maintenance light flickered off in the hangar, a mechanic touched the battered nose of a P-47 and muttered, "She don't die easy." He didn't know it, but that was already the legend, the gospel of the Jug, spreading through every airfield in Europe. Chapter 8: The Factory That Never Slept. While the P-47 was earning its reputation in the skies over Germany, another kind of war was raging thousands of miles away, not in the air, but on the factory floor. On Long Island, New York, Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant had become a city that never slept. The lights never went out, the machines never cooled, and the echo of rivet guns was a constant drumbeat of American industry. If the pilots over Europe were the muscle of the war, this was its heart, beating day and night, forging survival out of raw aluminum and sweat. The scale was beyond imagination. By early 1943, the Farmingdale plant covered 1.3 million square feet, the size of 28 football fields under one roof. 23,000 men and women worked 3 shifts around the clock, building P-47s like clockwork. At midnight, when the night shift arrived, workers would hand off still warm rivet guns mid-task. There was no pause, no silence, just an unbroken rhythm of creation. Republic's production process became a marvel of wartime logistics. The P-47 wasn't built linearly. It was assembled like a living organism. 14 major subassemblies, fuselage, wings, tail sections, engine mounts, landing gear, all took shape simultaneously in separate wings of the factory before converging on the main line like rivers joining a sea. Raw aluminum sheets rolled in by railcar at one end. 4 days later, a complete fighter taxied out the other under its own power. The assembly of each wing alone required more than 8,000 rivets, each one driven by hand. Inspectors checked every 10th rivet with X-ray equipment, and if a single one failed, it was drilled out and replaced. Mistakes were costly, but close enough wasn't in the Republic vocabulary. As one foreman liked to remind new hires, every bad rivet costs a pilot his heartbeat. The R-2800 engines arrived from Pratt and Whitney in Connecticut, already test-run and sealed in Cosmoline. Mechanics flushed the preservative grease, bolted the engines to the firewall with 38 precision-torqued bolts, and installed the massive turbo-supercharger system, the Thunderbolt's signature heart and lungs. One specialist did nothing else for 2 years straight but install those superchargers, 4 per shift, every shift. That was how industrial war looked, thousands of people mastering one motion until it became muscle memory. The paint crews worked like dancers. In a ventilated booth that could fit a small house, they sprayed each fighter in olive drab and neutral gray within 22 minutes. The air inside smelled of solvents, sweat, and victory. The aircraft rolled out still tacky, heading straight to final inspection. There, engines roared for 2-hour endurance runs, systems were cycled, and the last step came, the dive test. Each P-47 was strapped to a reinforced platform, the engine run to full power, and the dive brakes deployed. If anything snapped, better for it to happen here than at 30,000 feet. By 1944, Republic was producing 5,000 Thunderbolts a month, 1 aircraft every 103 minutes. Cost per unit dropped from $113,000 to $83,000 as efficiency soared. And Farmingdale wasn't alone. A second plant in Evansville, Indiana, and a third licensed line at Curtiss Wright in Buffalo turned the Thunderbolt into a symbol of American capacity. The Evansville plant alone produced 6,242 fighters before the war's end, in a city that, before 1942, had fewer than 80,000 residents. The miracle wasn't just the numbers, it was the people, teenagers, housewives, immigrants, and veterans of the Depression, learning to build something that could outfight the best of the Reich. For them, every bolt, every wing panel, every scarred hand was a contribution to survival. They were building armor not just for pilots, but for the idea that democracy could outproduce tyranny. When visitors walked through the plant, they said it sounded like thunder. Thousands of hammers, drills, and engines merging into one relentless voice. That sound was the true anthem of 1943 America. By the war's end, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had rolled off the lines. Not one of them was identical. Each carried the fingerprints of men and women who believed that perfection wasn't found in elegance but in endurance. At night, when the factory quieted for a moment before the next shift began, workers sometimes paused beside a newly finished P-47. Under the flicker of sodium lamps, the olive-green fuselage gleamed faintly. Someone would pat the cold metal and whisper what every pilot over Europe already knew: bring them home. Chapter 9. The Legacy That Wouldn't Die. When the war ended in 1945, accountants came for the numbers, but the P-47's story couldn't be captured on a balance sheet. 15,683 Thunderbolts had been built, over 30,500 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, tens of thousands of tanks, trains, and vehicles obliterated on the ground. Yet the most powerful statistic wasn't how many the Thunderbolt destroyed, it was how many it saved. Only 3,499 P-47s were lost to all causes. For every 4 that went down, 10 made it home. That meant thousands of fathers, sons, and brothers came back to American soil because Alexander Kartveli had refused to design a coffin with wings. His belief that a dead pilot can't win wars reshaped aviation forever. The redundancy, the armor, the focus on survivability all became doctrine. You can draw a straight line from his cluttered office in 1940 to every modern fighter cockpit surrounded by titanium and ejection systems today. When Kartveli died in 1974, the jets flying overhead, F-84s, F-105s, F-15s, all carried traces of his fingerprints. He never built the fastest or prettiest airplane. He built the one that refused to die. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a machine. It was proof that intelligence, endurance, and compassion for human life could coexist in the heart of war. And that's what makes its legacy immortal. Not speed, not firepower, but the simple idea that survival is the highest form of victory. Life application, the lesson of the Thunderbolt. The P-47 story isn't just about engineering, it's about philosophy. In a world obsessed with perfection and speed, Kartveli built something ugly, heavy, and impossible, and it endured. That lesson matters far beyond airplanes. Strength doesn't come from elegance, it comes from preparation, from designing for failure before it happens. In life, as in war, beauty fades under stress, but resilience endures. The Thunderbolt teaches us that true genius lies not in brilliance alone, but in care, the care to protect what matters most. Whether we build machines, families, or dreams, the goal isn't to be perfect. It's to survive every storm and come home intact. That's the real definition of indestructible. If this story made you stop for a moment, if it reminded you that war isn't just about destruction, but about intelligence, courage, and humanity, then you already understand what this channel stands for. We don't glorify battles or explosions. We decode history. We explore how ordinary people, engineers, soldiers, prisoners, and civilians, faced chaos with reason and endurance, and how their choices still shape the world we live in today. This channel is for those who believe history isn't just a list of dates and victories, but a mirror, one that reflects who we are and what we're capable of when everything is on the line. So if you believe truth deserves depth and knowledge should be felt as much as understood, stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe so YouTube knows you value stories like this and our next videos will reach you. More importantly, every like you give helps keep these quiet but powerful stories alive, in you and in everyone who still cares about history and what it means to be human. Because here, every video isn't just about war. It's about the people who lived through it. And sometimes understanding them helps us understand ourselves.